The land rose and fell in long, slow breaths, like an old animal dozing beneath the sky. Dry grasses bowed under the whispering wind, casting rippling shadows across the earth. In the distance, the Tetons stood like ancient, patient gods, their peaks veiled in the last light of day. Dust hovered in the air like something sacred refusing to settle. Everything moved slowly here, even time. Elias Briggs stood alone at the broken fence line, a rusted bucket of nails by his feet, and a hammer heavy in his hand. His face was a map of creased silence, skin like old parchment drawn tight over the bones of a man shaped more by waiting than by words. He wore the same broad-brimmed hat he had worn for decades, sweat-stained, sun-bleached, and silent witness to the long, still years. He did not curse the broken post. He did not mutter at the wind or the brittle wood. He simply drove each nail with deliberate rhythm, the metallic thud absorbed by the vastness around him. His eyes were tired but not weak. He had seen too much to be surprised anymore, or so he thought. The sound came on the wind like a question, a sharp clack, irregular and hesitant. He paused, one hand resting on the fence rail. The horizon glowed copper, bruised with the coming twilight. Again the sound, closer now. Hoof against stone. A broken gate. She emerged from the ridge above the south pasture, a wild mare, dust-coated and alone. Her flanks trembled with each step, one leg held stiff, and her head hung low. Her mane had thinned with the season, and her ribs showed faintly beneath her dun coat. But her eyes, even from a distance, held the deep defiance of untamed blood. Elias watched her approach without moving. The way she walked, favoring the left foreleg, told him enough. Injury, recent, maybe a bad stone, maybe worse. She stopped just beyond the edge of the fence, breathing hard, body shuddering with fatigue. Her hoof lifted once, then settled in the dirt again. Blood darkened the fetlock, glistening in the last orange slant of the sun. Elias exhaled through his nose and dropped the hammer into the bucket. He moved slow, not out of age, though age was there, but out of a deeper understanding, the kind that knows silence can speak louder than any kindness. He didn't approach her directly. He walked past the fence toward the small grove of aspens where the air held the scent of crushed bark and wet stone. She watched him, muscles taut, ears flicking. He knelt near a flat rock and found what he needed, a length of old rope and a smooth piece of driftwood washed up from a long, dry creek. He wrapped them tight, binding a makeshift bit with steady hands. When he turned back, she had not moved. Their eyes met across the field. He said nothing, only held the rope low, his palm open. The wind moved between them, carrying with it the scent of pine, smoke, and the faraway echo of water. A sound older than language. She didn't come to him, but she didn't bolt either. Step by limping step, he closed the distance. At 10 feet he stopped, waited, let her smell the dust and sweat on his clothes, let her feel that he would not rush her. The sun dropped below the ridgeline, casting the plain in twilight. At 5 feet, he saw the damage clearly, a long, jagged nail buried deep in the soft flesh of her hoof, not fresh. Maybe a day, maybe 2. Infection already swelling around the wound. He spoke now, but not in words meant to be understood. Just low sound, half-hummed, half-breathed. The kind of noise that comes from remembering lullabies you once heard from someone long gone. The mare blinked, ears forward. She allowed the rope. Elias worked quickly, but gently. He tied the rope into a loose halter and let her lean into him as he bent low. The smell of blood and old iron filled his lungs. His fingers found the edge of the nail and gripped it with the folded cloth in his shirt pocket. One pull. She jolted, but did not rear. It came free with a wet pop. Blood flowed freely now, but the pressure was gone. He pressed the cloth against it, whispering nothing in particular, just letting his breath steady hers. When it had slowed, he let her go. She stood a moment longer, eyes unreadable, then turned. The herd was nowhere in sight. No thunder of hooves or distant whinny called her back. She limped across the fading field alone, her dark shape growing smaller with each step until she was swallowed by the coming night. Elias remained by the fence, the bloodied cloth in his hand, the hammer and bucket forgotten behind him. Overhead, the stars began to kindle in the darkening sky, slow and patient. Something had shifted, not in the land that remained vast and indifferent, but in the quiet between moments, in the place where hoofbeats echo long after the sound is gone. He watched the ridgeline long after she vanished, and then, without looking back, he turned and walked home. The sun had not yet risen when Elias opened his eyes. Light had not touched the plains, but something had. He sat up slowly on the cot, the same way he always did, careful with his lower back, left shoulder stiff from an old wound that no longer needed a name. The room was gray with the suggestion of dawn, the familiar outlines of the cabin steeped in stillness, the tin basin on the table, the rust-colored scarf hanging by the door, the cold stove, quiet in the dark. Outside something moved, not the wind, not coyotes, not cattle. He swung his legs down and paused, listening. The sound was heavy but not threatening, a soft shifting, like breath on dry earth, a low rhythmic scraping, 100 hooves adjusting weight, not running, not restless, waiting. Elias rose and stepped to the door. He pushed it open, slow and quiet like it was a church gate. The cold hit first, dry and thin, the kind of air that carried no scent but still tasted of something old, like stone and snowmelt. The sky was a wash of pale ash, the first light of morning, still trembling behind the mountains. They were everywhere. Horses, dozens, maybe more than 80, surrounding his house in a vast living ring. Some grazed with heads bowed low, others stood motionless, eyes turned toward the cabin, breath rising from their nostrils in quiet puffs that caught the early light. The herd stretched from the fence line across the fields up the rise toward the ridge, filling the land like a silent tide. In the center, not 15 feet from the front porch, stood the mare. She was still limping slightly, but her body held a new weight, not fatigue but command. Dust and dried blood clung to her fetlock, but her eyes were calm, deep as an old well. She watched Elias the way one watches fire, not afraid, not expectant, just aware. He didn't step outside, not yet. He stood in the doorway, bare feet on old wood, hands resting on the doorframe. He looked at her, and she looked back, and for a moment there was nothing between them but the sound of the wind threading its way through the horses' manes. Then, without ceremony, he turned and went back inside. He dressed in silence, heavy boots, worn flannel, a thick wool coat with a hole at the hem that he never bothered to patch. The routine grounded him, the slow motions of coffee brewed on the stove, hands moving without thought. When the cabin filled with the bitter scent, he poured one cup and carried it back to the porch. The mare was still there. So were the others. He sat, not on the chair. That would suggest permanence, invitation. He sat on the top step, steam rising from his mug, watching the herd with the same stillness they offered him. They didn't move, not toward him, not away, no snorts, no rearing. Just the occasional shift of weight, the low grunt of a stallion further off, a tail flicking against a winter fly. They were not afraid, but they were not his. Time passed without making a sound. The sun finally crested the horizon, bathing the herd in gold. The frost on their backs melted in slow rivulets. Elias squinted into the light and watched as a colt near the edge of the porch lifted its nose, sniffing at the air. A few others looked up, but none approached. He took another sip of coffee and let the heat settle in his chest. They weren't here to threaten. He didn't need to understand them. Not really. Something had happened the night before. Something not meant to be explained in words. He had pulled a nail from a bleeding foot, and now the world had bent in reply. A gift, a vigil, a warning, he couldn't say. But they had come, and that meant something. As the sun climbed higher, Elias moved through the rhythms of his morning. He fed the chickens, scattering corn across the cold ground. The hens clucked nervously, wary of the watching hooves just beyond the coop. He drew water from the well, the creak of the rope sounding loud in the otherwise hushed world. Through it all, the horses remained. A woman from town might have called it a miracle. A ranch hand might have called it trouble. But Elias, he didn't name it. He just worked. By midday, the wind picked up. The sky turned a shade bluer. He watched dust spin in the fields, watched the sun catch in the horses' coats, turning them to bronze and silver. The mare moved a little now, stepping from her place by the porch to the corner of the field. The others shifted with her, a fluid, wordless current. Still, they did not leave. That evening, as dusk returned and the fields turned the color of worn leather, Elias lit a lantern in the window. It was a habit more than a necessity. He hadn't expected company in years. But something about the way the herd waited made the gesture feel necessary. Not for them, for him. He sat by the fire, hands wrapped around a second mug of coffee gone cold. The night was quiet. Even the coyotes seemed unsure of their place in the world now. Outside, the mare watched the cabin as though it were a heartbeat, and the wild stayed wild, but only just. The days passed without shape, like wind across the prairie, seen only by what it moved. The wild horses did not leave. They stayed through the frost-bitten mornings and the blue-shadowed afternoons, through snow flurries that whispered against the windows, and nights so still Elias could hear his own breath above the crackling stove. Always watching, always near, their presence pressed into the air like a silent hymn. He never counted them again after that first morning. Whether there were 70 or 80 or 100 made no difference. What mattered was that they remained, grazing on the dead grasses, drinking from the creek that curved along the edge of his property. Standing at dawn like statues of breath and bone, he moved around them without fear but not without care. The horses formed a perimeter, not a fence, not a barrier, but a presence. One morning, when he walked toward the south field with a spade over his shoulder, a young stallion stepped in front of him and stood unmoving until Elias turned back. He didn't try again. The message was clear enough. That land belonged to them now. He let it be. Instead, he tended what they allowed him, his home, his garden, his old chickens, too dumb or too stubborn to notice the wildness pressing against their world. He swept the porch, repaired the hinge on the barn door, split the last of the firewood, and stacked it under the awning, each motion slow, precise, ritual-like. The days grew colder. On the third evening, as Elias lit the stove, he found himself standing at the bookshelf. It had gathered dust and spiderwebs in the corners, unread for months. His hand hovered over a leather-bound journal, his wife's. The cover was cracked and soft from time. He didn't open it. He took a different volume, a book on horses, anatomy, care, breeding, yellowed pages, and hand-drawn diagrams. He carried it to the chair near the fire and turned pages without reading, his eyes following the curves of illustrations that spoke more clearly than words. He had never owned wild horses. He had seen them before, up near Wind River and west of Thermopolis, silhouettes vanishing into the hills. But they had never come to him, never watched him with those wide, knowing eyes. He wondered, not for the first time, if they were waiting. For what? He didn't know. It was the colt who broke the rhythm. Late in the fourth afternoon, just before the sun touched the far hills, the young one approached. Not a newborn, but not fully grown. Legs too long for his body, mane like smoke drifting over his neck. He stepped softly through the cold field, parting the other horses as he moved. Elias sat on the porch, sharpening the blade of a hatchet, but stopped when he saw the colt. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Elias reached into the bag beside him and pulled out an apple, bruised and soft with age. He placed it on the step and leaned back. The colt hesitated, sniffed, took one slow step, then another. He didn't rush, didn't show hunger, only curiosity. When he reached the apple, he sniffed it once more, then lifted it gently in his teeth. Elias didn't move, didn't speak. The colt chewed slowly, juice dripping down his chin. Then he turned and walked back into the herd. That night, Elias dreamed. Not a loud dream, no gunfire or galloping hooves, just a field. A woman's voice humming in another room, a child's laughter, distant and light. He didn't try to hold on to it. When he woke, it was already fading, like breath on a mirror. Snow fell the next morning, slow, deliberate flakes that dusted the backs of the horses until they looked like ghost creatures from another world. The silence deepened. Even the wind seemed to tiptoe through the land. Inside, Elias poured warm oats into a bowl, added honey, sat by the window. He didn't eat much anymore, didn't need to. He watched the mare. She was near the barn now, her limp nearly gone. She hadn't approached him since that first day, but he felt her gaze often, felt it as he split wood, fed the hens, pulled ice from the trough. There were no fences between them, but boundaries still held. By the seventh day, he began to remember the years he had spent trying to forget. The faces came first. His daughter, Rose, standing at the edge of the corral, arms crossed, eyes bright with things she couldn't yet name. She had loved the horses, not in a child's way, but with a kind of reverence. She used to speak to them in whispers as though they held answers she could not ask her parents for. His wife, Lydia, quieter still, always by the fire, pen in hand, notebooks filled with sketches and fragments of dreams she never finished. She had painted once, then stopped. Elias never asked why. She had looked out the window in the same way the mare did now, as though watching for something she couldn't see, but believed was there. They had left within a year of each other. Lydia, to illness. Rose, just left. No letters, no explanations. Elias hadn't spoken to anyone about them in years, not to the grocer in town, not to the preacher who stopped by every third Sunday to drop off canned goods and say little else, not even to himself. Now, in the presence of these silent creatures, it all stirred again, like dust rising from the floorboards after too many still years. And maybe that's what they were, not just animals, but reminders of what had been, of what still ached beneath the surface, of the quiet pact between man and memory. That evening, when the sun dipped behind a curtain of snow clouds and the world turned silver, Elias stepped into the field. The horses parted for him. No panic, no snorts. Just space. Given, not taken. He walked slowly, his boots crunching through the frost. He stopped near the mare. She turned her head toward him. He said nothing, simply stood. For a moment, they were two old souls facing each other across a lifetime, and the land, that great and watching thing, held its breath. The storm came low, crawling over the western ridge like a slow, pale beast. Elias could feel it in the air before the sky darkened, in the silence between wind gusts, in the weight behind the clouds, in the way the wild horses stopped grazing and turned their heads toward the horizon all at once. The temperature dropped so fast it felt like a door had opened somewhere far away and let winter in. He pulled the barn door shut behind him and braced it with a length of iron chain. The old structure groaned in the wind. The horses outside shifted, restless now, but still silent, not from fear, but from recognition. This was not a new thing. Storms had lived in their bones longer than Elias had drawn breath. By late afternoon, snow fell thick and straight, no longer playful or light. It buried the fields in hush. The wild herd stood like dark sculptures against the white, their breath rising like smoke signals. None fled. They endured it, motionless. Elias stepped back into the cabin, shook the snow from his coat, and leaned his back against the door. The wood was warm from the stove still roaring in the hearth. His eyes adjusted to the orange flicker of the flames, but even the fire couldn't hold back the image of what lay just outside, the weight of 80 living creatures unmoved by the storm. He didn't light a lamp. Instead, he sat by the fire and watched the shadows stretch and settle. His hands rested on his knees. He thought of Lydia again, of how she'd sit by this same fire, sketching the curve of a ridge or the silhouette of a deer glimpsed at dusk. She used to say the world was loud, even when it was quiet. You just had to listen harder. And now, after all this time, he could almost hear it again. A wind howl rose up from the plains and rattled the shutters. Elias stood and checked the latch, then moved to the kitchen. He poured oats into a bucket, added water, stirred it with the back of a spoon until it became a thick, steaming paste. Then he wrapped himself in his coat again, pulled his gloves on slow, and stepped back into the white. The snow was deeper now, past his ankles, and the air sharp enough to sting the inside of his nose. He trudged toward the barn, bucket swinging from one hand. The wild herd shifted, not away, just subtly creating a quiet corridor for him to pass through. A few shook snow from their backs, ears twitching. The colt, the same one who had taken the apple, stepped into view again. He stood near the barn door, half covered in snow, legs braced against the wind. Elias met his eyes briefly, then pulled open the barn with a hard tug. The wind caught it, howled inside the timbers. The interior was warm, but not inviting. Dry hay, the smell of old leather, the sweet tang of grain. A space built for use, not comfort. He left the door open, set the bucket down, and walked back into the storm. That was the invitation. They came slow, one by one at first, then in pairs. Not rushing, not hesitating, just moving, with decision, with grace. The mare was the last to enter. She stood just outside the barn door as the snow swept sideways across her back. Her eyes found his again. Something in them shimmered. Not thanks, not submission, but something older, nameless. Then she walked past him into the dark warmth without a sound. By nightfall, the barn was full. Hooves on hay, quiet breath, the soft creak of wood underweight. Elias sat just outside the door, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, his lantern unlit. He didn't want to break the spell of it, the quiet, the trust. The snow thickened, covered the windows, softened the land into shapelessness. Inside the barn, a single whinny broke the silence, long and low. Not a call, not fear, just a sound, a reminder. Elias leaned his head against the barn wall and closed his eyes. And in that half-sleep, where memory and dream overlap, he saw Rose again. Not as she'd left, but as she'd once been. Barefoot in the tall grass, arms out, laughing as the wind pushed at her hair. A wild horse just beyond her, walking beside her, not ridden, not tamed, just near. Then Lydia, standing at the window of this very cabin, sketching it all with a smile so faint it could have been the wind. He woke when the snow stopped. It was nearly dawn, and the sky above the ridge was beginning to bruise with color. The storm had passed, and in its place was silence even deeper than before, the kind that only comes after something holy. The barn was warm with breath and quiet life. He stepped inside. They didn't startle, didn't move. They just watched him, one by one, eyes catching the weak morning light filtering through the cracks in the wood. The mare stood in the center, surrounded by others pressed shoulder to shoulder, their bodies radiating a deep old warmth that no fire could match. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Instead, he leaned against the stall gate and listened to the sound of hooves on straw. A colt nuzzled his coat. He reached down and let his hand rest on the soft muzzle, fingers brushing against the damp velvet of its nose. It was, perhaps, the first time he had touched anything with that kind of tenderness in years. No pact had been spoken, but one had been made, in the wind, in the snow, in the quiet breath of creatures who remembered things man had forgotten. When the first sunbeam slid across the fields, painting the white world gold, the horses began to move. One by one they stepped into the dawn, their hooves muffled by the deep snow, their bodies casting long shadows across the land. Elias didn't follow. He simply stood in the doorway, snow rising past his boots, watching as they drifted away. Not fleeing, not vanishing, just leaving as they had come. Only the mare remained, She turned back once, her eyes catching his again, still filled with that same unknowable depth. She stepped forward. He didn't flinch when she touched her nose to his chest, breath warm even through the layers of wool and flannel. Her ears flicked back, then forward again. Her heart beat. He could feel it, slow and strong. Then she turned and was gone. Elias stood in the snow, surrounded by hoofprints, the barn behind him, and silence draped over the land like a blanket not yet shaken. Above him, the sky opened into blue, and the wind, no longer rushing, settled into stillness, as if it, too, had been waiting for this. Morning returned without thunder, without revelation, only light, wide and low, spilling across the land like a whisper. The snow was still deep but soft now, the edges rounded gentle. In its wake it had left silence, not the silence of absence, but of something complete. Elias stood at the edge of the porch, his boot soles buried in the white. The barn behind him still smelled of hay and horse sweat, and something almost sacred. But it was empty now. The warmth had faded with the hoofbeats. They had all gone. The herd had moved eastward, over the low ridge and into the broken horizon. No trail, no sound. Just vanished, as if they'd only ever been snow shadows and wind ghosts. But the marks were there, dozens of hoofprints pressed like memory into the drift, tracing slow arcs around his home, around him. A map written in silence. He didn't move for a long time. The land had become still again, but not the same stillness. Something had shifted, not in the earth, not in the weather, but in Elias himself. A weight had been moved, not lifted, just set aside. The wind touched his face and did not sting. It moved around him like an old dog finding its place again, circling, before settling near the fire. Back inside the cabin the stove had gone out. He didn't relight it. He let the cold remain, pressing in from the windows, seeping through the floorboards. He welcomed it. It reminded him that he was not numb, not entirely. He sat at the table where Lydia used to draw. For the first time in 15 winters, he opened her sketchbook. The pages crackled, dry and delicate. Pencil marks swirled across the yellowed sheets, horses, birds, silhouettes of the mountain. But not just nature. There were people, too. A girl by a fence, a man in profile, hat pulled low, and one sketch, almost faded to nothing, of a mare, limbs slender, eyes wide, a wound in the hoof. Elias exhaled slowly and closed the book. Outside, the light shifted. Clouds moved like slow ships across the sky. A hawk passed overhead alone, wings stretched wide, its cry cutting the quiet in half. Later that afternoon, Elias walked to the fence line, hammer in hand. The same old hammer, same bucket of nails. He worked slowly, as he always had, driving each nail with purpose, each motion a quiet ceremony. The wood accepted the metal like it had been waiting for it. The fence would not keep anything in or out. It wasn't for that anymore. It was a gesture, a reminder to the land that he was still here, still breathing, still watching. By dusk, he had repaired 3 posts. The sun set behind the Tetons, turning them a burnt silver, like ash in the shape of mountains. Elias sat on the porch with a tin cup of black coffee, now lukewarm. He sipped it slowly, listening to the wind through the grasses, now unburdened by snow. A sound reached him, faint, distant, not hoofbeats, not the call of an animal. It was something softer, the rustle of cottonwood leaves, the creak of old timbers, the kind of sound that might come from inside a memory. He rose and walked to the edge of the porch, eyes squinting toward the ridge where the mare had last stood. There was nothing there, only the low arc of the land, the slow breath of earth. But he stayed long after the light had gone, stayed until the stars came out, until Orion hung over the chimney and the moon split the snow with silver threads. And it was there, in the deepest hush of night, that he saw her. Not the mare, not exactly, but a shape in the field, slender, still, eyes reflecting starlight. She didn't move, neither did he. It wasn't vision, not the kind that required light. It was knowing that what had happened was real, that something had come to him in the silence and left something behind. Not a horse, not even a memory, but a space. A place where things once closed had opened. He didn't speak. He only tipped his hat slow and deliberate, like a man saying goodbye without bitterness. And the shape turned and disappeared into the night. The next morning came quietly. Elias opened the door to the cabin and stepped out barefoot into the snow. It was melting now. Small rivulets ran down the sloping field toward the creek. The hoof prints had faded, softened into vague impressions. Soon they would be gone. He walked without hurry to the center of the yard and stood still. The air was warmer, the wind light. Overhead the sky stretched cloudless and clean, blue like the inside of a riverstone. He closed his eyes, listened. Nothing and everything. The wind in the distance, the creak of thawing trees, the faint living hush of the earth beginning to breathe again. And in that moment Elias understood that this was not a gift, not a visitation. It had been an answer to a question he hadn't known he'd asked. He turned, walked back toward the house, left the door open, and let the wind come in.